My parents faked my death to claim my life insurance while I was abroad. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. The customs agent didn't stamp my passport. He looked at his screen, turned pale, and whispered, "Sir, this man died 6 months ago." I stared at him, letting out a confused, sleep-deprived laugh. I was 25, exhausted from a 20-hour flight back from Southeast Asia, and smelling faintly of mosquito repellent and stale airport coffee. "I think there's been a mistake," I said, leaning against the sterile counter. "I'm Marcus. That's my face on the passport." The agent didn't smile. He pressed a button under his desk. Within 30 seconds, 2 armed CBP officers were flanking me, treating me not like a weary traveler returning home, but like a ghost trying to smuggle itself across the border. They escorted me to a windowless secondary screening room. The fluorescent lights hummed above as an officer laid my passport on the metal table. "Where did you get this book?" he demanded, his voice flat and interrogative. "From the passport agency. 5 years ago. Because it is mine," I insisted, my heart finally starting to pound. "Listen, I've been off-grid volunteering for a year. I'm just trying to get home to my family." The officer slid a printed paper across the table. It was a digital scan of a death certificate. My name, my date of birth, issued by the state I grew up in, stamped and finalized exactly 6 months prior. The cause of death was listed as presumptive natural disaster. I felt the blood drain from my face. "This is insane," I stammered. "You are looking right at me. I have my driver's license in my bag. You can call my parents right now. David and Susan. They live in." I rattled off my home address. The officers exchanged a heavy, unreadable look. "We did call the residence, son," the older officer said softly. "The people at that number confirmed Marcus is deceased." My world violently tilted on its axis as the air left my lungs. My parents, my own flesh and blood, had answered the phone and verified that I was dead. They had my passport confiscated, handed me a temporary alien ID, and told me to contact the local authorities to clear up what they assumed was a severe identity theft issue. Little did I know, the thieves were the people who raised me. I walked out of the airport completely alone, wondering what they were hiding. To understand how someone can just disappear off the face of the earth, you have to understand where I went. I had taken a gap year to volunteer in a profoundly remote, mountainous region of Indonesia, helping build a clean water system for a network of isolated villages. The cell service was non-existent. To send a single text message, I had to hike 3 miles up a dirt ridge, hoping the wind blew the right way to catch a faint 3G signal. My parents, David and Susan, knew this. Before I left, I sat in their kitchen and explained that I might go weeks or even months without checking in. My dad, always cold and calculating, just nodded and told me not to expect any financial bailouts if things went south. My mom kissed my cheek, more focused on how her hair looked than my itinerary. 5 months into the trip, the disaster struck. It wasn't an earthquake, but a massive, catastrophic flood that wiped out the only bridge connecting our village to the mainland province. We were entirely stranded for months. We survived on rationed rice and whatever we could forage, cut off from all global communication. It was terrifying, but we managed. I assumed my family would be watching the news, worried sick, but knowing I was resourceful. I imagined my mom crying to her friends, my dad pacing the floor. It turns out, they were using that flood as a convenient, golden opportunity. While I was hauling mud out of flooded huts and surviving on rainwater, they were fast-tracking a presumptive death certificate. They used the regional blackout to their absolute advantage, telling local courts and insurance agencies that I had been swept away. In reality, I had survived the flood without a single scratch, completely oblivious to the fact that back in the United States, my memory was being monetized. It took a military airlift to finally evacuate our volunteer team to Jakarta, where I immediately bought a standby ticket home, wanting nothing more than to surprise my family and tell them I was alive. I didn't even bother trying to find a phone to call ahead. I just wanted to see their faces light up. I had no idea that my survival was about to become their absolute worst nightmare. Navigating your home country without a valid ID or a working bank card is a distinctly terrifying experience. After being released from the sterile confines of airport customs with nothing but a flimsy temporary credential, I took a painfully expensive cash cab to my local bank branch. I just needed enough money to get a hotel or rent a car. The teller, a young woman with bright glasses, swiped my debit card and frowned at her monitor. She tried it again, her brow furrowing deeper. Sir, I'm sorry, but this card is coming up as invalid. Let me pull up the account manually. I handed over my temporary alien ID, explaining the bizarre customs mix-up. She typed my social security number into her system, and I watched the exact moment her demeanor completely shifted. She gasped, pushing her chair back from the desk as if I had brought a weapon into the lobby. I need to get my manager, she stammered, hurrying away. The manager emerged minutes later, looking incredibly stern and incredibly nervous. He asked me to step into his office and shut the door. Mr. Marcus, I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, he said, his voice trembling slightly. But this account was closed and liquidated by the estate executors 5 months ago. The account holder is marked as legally deceased in the Federal Registry. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. Liquidated? By who? I demanded, my voice rising in panic. By your parents, David and Susan. They presented a court-ordered death certificate and claimed the remaining balances as your next of kin, the manager explained, sliding a printed ledger across the desk. It showed my life savings, around $20,000, transferred out in a single wire. My parents hadn't just confirmed I was dead, they had actively raided my accounts. I left the bank feeling utterly hollowed out, walking miles through the familiar suburban streets of my hometown because I couldn't afford bus fare. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. My parents were wealthy. My dad owned a lucrative contracting business. Why would they steal the meager savings of their 25-year-old son? The sheer, terrifying absurdity of the situation gnawed at my sanity with every step I took. I finally turned the corner onto my childhood street and froze dead in my tracks. The house I grew up in was a modest 4-bedroom colonial, comfortable but aging. But the house I was staring at now was a sprawling, newly renovated compound. The cracked driveway was now pristine stamped concrete. A brand new luxury SUV and a sleek sports car sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The roof was new, the landscaping was immaculate, and a massive addition had been built onto the back. It looked like they had won the lottery. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked up to the custom mahogany front door and pressed the doorbell. It chimed a melodic, unfamiliar tune. I heard footsteps, the turning of a heavy deadbolt, and then the door swung open. It was my mother, Susan. She was wearing designer clothes I'd never seen before, her hair freshly blown out, holding a crystal glass of iced tea. She looked at me. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering into 100 pieces on the hardwood floor. But she didn't scream in joy. She didn't fall to her knees praising God that her lost son was alive. She turned absolute chalk white, her eyes wide with unadulterated, raw terror. Mom, I croaked, my throat tight with emotion. I'm alive. I made it back. Before she could speak, my father, David, rounded the corner from his new home office. Susan, what did you break? He stopped dead. The color drained from his face just as quickly as hers. The silence in the foyer was suffocating, heavy with a dark, unspeakable dread. Marcus, my father finally whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying blend of shock and anger. He didn't rush forward to embrace me. Instead, he reached out, grabbed my arm with a bruising grip, and yanked me violently inside, slamming the heavy mahogany door shut and throwing the deadbolt. He dragged me into the kitchen, his eyes frantically scanning the windows to see if any neighbors had noticed my arrival. What are you doing here? He hissed, pacing the floor like a trapped animal. You are supposed to be dead. You cannot be here. The sheer cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They weren't relieved, they were caught. I stared at the parents who raised me and realized they were afraid of me. The gaslighting began immediately. My mother finally broke out of her terrified paralysis and began to hyperventilate, putting on a sudden, theatrical display of maternal panic. We thought you were gone, she wailed, clutching her chest but keeping a bizarre, physical distance from me. The embassy told us the village was completely washed away. We were grieving Marcus. We were utterly broken. I looked around the pristine, newly remodeled kitchen, staring at the marble countertops and the brand-new, commercial-grade appliances. You were grieving so hard you completely gutted the house and bought 2 luxury cars? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. My father stepped between us, his posture aggressive and defensive. "Don't you dare speak to your mother that way." We had to move on. The house was falling apart. We needed a fresh start after the tragedy. He poured himself a glass of scotch, his hands trembling slightly. "The paperwork, the death certificate. The courts pushed it through because of the scale of the disaster. We were just following legal advice." But his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously toward the hallway. "You can't just walk back into society, Marcus. It's incredibly complicated. It could take years to reverse this. You need to stay hidden here, in the basement, until I can figure out how to handle the lawyers." He was actively trying to lock me away in my own home. I refused to break eye contact with him. "Dad, the customs agents flagged my passport. They already know I'm physically in the country. The bank knows I was there today. I'm not hiding in the basement like some kind of dirty secret." My mother grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "Marcus, please, you have to listen to your father. If people find out you're alive right now, the financial implications, the taxes, it will ruin us." It was the most sickening thing I had ever heard. My literal existence was an inconvenience to their newfound wealth. I realized then that I wasn't in a safe haven. I was in a hostile environment, completely surrounded by enemies disguised as family. I pulled my arm away from her and backed toward the kitchen door. I knew I needed to find my sister before they could poison her against me. I managed to slip out the back door while my father was frantically dialing his attorney. I walked 3 miles to the upscale apartment complex where my older sister, Chloe, lived. I prayed she wasn't part of this twisted masquerade. When she opened her door and saw me standing there, dirty and exhausted, she didn't react with terror. Her knees buckled. She literally collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably, screaming my name. I dropped to the ground and held her, tears finally spilling down my own face. This was the reaction I had expected. This was grief turning into miraculous relief. Once she could finally breathe, I helped her to the couch and explained the horrors of the last 24 hours, the customs detainment, the liquidated bank account, and our parents' horrifying reaction to my survival. Chloe looked utterly bewildered. "Marcus, they told me they had hired private investigators in Indonesia. They told me they spent thousands looking for your body." Then, her expression shifted into a look of sudden, sickening realization. "The insurance," she whispered, her hands covering her mouth. "What insurance?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Dad's contracting business was going bankrupt while you were away," Chloe explained, her voice trembling. "They were weeks away from foreclosure on the house. Then, right after the disaster, Dad announced that the business was miraculously saved. He said he found an angel investor." She paused, her eyes wide with horror. "Marcus, a month later, they were drunk at dinner. Mom slipped up and mentioned a $2 million life insurance payout. They told me you had a policy through your volunteer agency. What is the going rate for a son's life?" "Apparently, $2 million. The pieces violently snapped together in my mind. The immediate house renovations, the luxury cars, the absolute terror in their eyes when I walked through the front door. They hadn't just moved on from my death. They had explicitly profited from it. And my sudden resurrection was a $2 million liability that threatened to destroy their entire fraudulent empire. I had to prove they knew I was alive, and I needed professional help immediately. The next morning, I began the excruciating bureaucratic nightmare of coming back to life. Because my accounts were frozen and I legally didn't exist, I couldn't even hire a lawyer. Chloe bravely let me use her car and gave me some cash. My first stop was the county clerk's office to request a physical copy of my own death certificate. The clerk looked at me like I was insane, but after presenting my voided passport and temporary ID, she reluctantly pulled the file. I sat in my sister's car and read the document that ended my life. The date of issuance was alarming. The disaster in Indonesia happened on August 12th. The death certificate was finalized and stamped by a local judge on September 4th. That was incredibly, suspiciously fast for an international presumptive death case, which normally takes years to process. I needed someone who understood the dark mechanics of this system. I reached out to a contact Chloe had found online, Investigator Miller, a sharp, cynical insurance fraud detective who specialized in complex financial crimes. We met at a nondescript diner on the edge of town. Miller was a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a mind like a steel trap. He reviewed my paperwork over a cup of black coffee, his expression growing darker by the second. Your parents definitely greased the wheels here, kid, Miller grunted, tapping the official seal on the paper. They pushed this through a specific, friendly judge who handles fast-track estate liquidations. But the real smoking gun isn't the death certificate itself. It's the policy payout. I've been making some calls. Your parents filed the claim literally hours after the news broke about the Indonesian floods. He leaned across the sticky table, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. Insurance companies don't just hand over $2 million in 3 weeks unless the paperwork is absolutely airtight. Your parents planned this. They had all the forms ready to go. We just need to find out when the policy was actually written. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. We broke into my father's home office that night, searching for the original insurance contract. Sneaking into the house I grew up in felt like breaking into a stranger's fortress. We waited until my parents left for a high society charity dinner, ironically funded by my supposed demise. Chloe let us in through the side door, her hands shaking violently. Investigator Miller and I slipped into my father's newly expanded home office. It reeked of expensive leather and arrogance. Miller went straight for the locked filing cabinets, picking the simple lock with practiced ease. We scoured folders labeled estate, business taxes, and finally, life. Miller pulled out a thick manila envelope and spread the contents across the mahogany desk. It was the complete life insurance policy. As I scanned the documents, my blood ran completely cold. This wasn't a policy provided by my volunteer agency. It was a private, massive term life policy taken out on me, naming David and Susan as the sole beneficiaries. But the most horrifying detail wasn't the $2 million payout. It was the date at the top of the application. The policy was initiated and finalized a full 3 months before I ever left for my trip. My parents didn't just capitalize on a sudden tragedy. They had laid the groundwork for my death while I was still sitting at their dinner table. I stared at the signature line. Marcus, written in a messy, looping scrawl that looked absolutely nothing like my handwriting. They forged my signature. I whispered, the psychological horror of the betrayal fully setting in. My parents had looked me in the eye, kissed me goodbye at the airport, knowing perfectly well that I was worth more to them dead in a ditch than alive and breathing. Miller took out a small digital camera and began photographing every single page, focusing specifically on the forged signatures and the date stamps. This is textbook first-degree insurance fraud, Miller muttered, snapping a photo of the payout confirmation. And forgery. And perjury. Your parents are looking at serious federal time if we hand this over to the prosecutor. The reality of the situation crashed down on me with crushing weight. I was holding the exact piece of paper that could send my parents to prison. The premeditation was the hardest part to swallow. It gnawed at my soul like a parasite. After we left the house and returned to Chloe's apartment, I sat on her balcony in the freezing night air, completely paralyzed by the psychological devastation. My parents had actively willed me to die. As I reviewed the photos of the evidence with Miller, we found something even more sinister in my father's printed email logs. During the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the volunteer agency had sent out a mass email to emergency contacts. It stated that while communications were down, satellite imagery showed our specific clinic site was on high ground and untouched by the floodwaters. They explicitly advised families that the volunteers were likely safe and just isolated. My father had received that email. He had opened it. He had read it. And he had deliberately deleted it without telling anyone, pressing forward with the death certificate petition the very next day. He actively suppressed proof of my life to secure his wealth. Chloe sat beside me, crying quietly as she read the printed email log. They let me mourn you, she sobbed, her voice cracking. I planned a memorial service. I picked out a stone, and they just stood there, comforting me, knowing the whole time that you were probably fine. I felt a dark, righteous anger burning away the last remnants of my naive, familial love. They weren't my parents anymore. They were parasites. They had traded my existence for granite countertops and imported cars. Miller packed up his laptop and looked at me seriously. Marcus, we have enough to go to the feds right now. But if we do, your parents will immediately transfer the cash into offshore accounts and drag this out in court for a decade while you stay legally dead. We need to catch them dead to rights, attempting to silence you. We need to force their hand. We didn't have to wait long, because my phone suddenly lit up with a text. The text was from an unknown number, but I knew exactly who it was. "We know you talked to Chloe. We need to handle this as a family. Come to the house tonight. We have a solution that benefits everyone." They had realized I wasn't just a ghost wandering the streets. I was a live wire threatening to burn their entire mansion to the ground. I showed the message to Investigator Miller. He smiled grimly. "This is it. They're scared. They are going to try to buy you off. It's the classic move of a cornered fraudster." I agreed to meet them at 8 o'clock. When I walked into the lavish dining room, my parents were sitting at the long oak table, looking remarkably composed, yet entirely hollow. There was a sleek leather briefcase sitting between them. My father didn't offer a greeting. He just stared at me with cold, shark-like eyes. "Let's be practical, Marcus," my father started, his voice eerily calm. "What's done is done. The money has been invested. The business is saved. If you expose this, everyone loses. We go to jail, and the government seizes every penny. You get nothing but a massive legal bill." He slid the heavy leather briefcase across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of me. "There is $500,000 in cash in there," my mother chimed in, her voice sickeningly sweet, trying to play the caring mother. "You always wanted to travel, sweetheart. You can take this money, move to Europe, change your name, and start a beautiful new life. We can even wire you more later. You just have to stay out of the country and stay legally deceased." I stared at the briefcase, feeling physically sick. They were offering me $500,000 to permanently erase my own identity. They were bribing me to accept my own murder. I looked up at the two monsters who had given me life, realizing they were completely devoid of human empathy. I had to play the part perfectly if I wanted to destroy them. I slowly reached out, placed my hand firmly on the briefcase, and feigned a sigh. 500,000. I repeated slowly, letting my fingers trace the brass clasps of the briefcase. I forced myself to look conflicted, letting my shoulders slump as if the weight of the situation was breaking my resolve. "And if I take this, I just disappear? I can never come back? Never see Chloe again?" My mother leaned forward, sensing weakness. "Oh, darling, it's for the best. Chloe will understand eventually. With this money, you can be anyone you want to be. It's freedom, Marcus. Absolute freedom." I pretended to bite my lip, staring at the leather grain. The truth was, Miller had wired me with a microscopic transmitter hidden in my jacket button. He was parked in a plain white van 3 houses down, recording every single syllable. But a recorded conversation wasn't enough to permanently freeze their stolen assets. We needed documented intent. "Cash is great, Dad," I said, looking up with feigned calculation. "But it's heavy, and it's dangerous to travel with. If you want me gone permanently, I need a signed agreement. An NDA. And I want the rest of the cut, another 500,000, wired to a secure offshore account. I need a guarantee you won't just cut me off once I cross the border." My father frowned, his business instincts kicking in, but his desperation ultimately overruled his caution. "Fine," he snapped, completely falling for the bait. "I can draft a non-disclosure agreement citing a private settlement. And I can set up a wire transfer for tomorrow morning. But you sign it, you take the cash, and you leave tonight. Understood?" I nodded slowly, playing the greedy, defeated son to perfection. "Have the paperwork ready tomorrow at noon," I said, standing up and pushing the briefcase back toward him. "I'll sign it, and then you'll never see me again." I walked out of that house feeling a dangerous, electric thrill of absolute vengeance pumping through my veins. The trap was set, baited, and they had walked right into it without a second thought. I met Miller in the van, and we prepared to completely destroy my parents' lives. The next day at exactly noon, the atmosphere in my parents' sprawling dining room was suffocating. The massive mahogany table, bought with blood money, was cleared except for a stack of freshly printed legal documents and the briefcase of cash. My father sat at the head, a gold pin resting perfectly parallel to the papers. My mother stood nervously by the window, obsessively adjusting her diamond bracelet. What they didn't know was that Chloe was sitting silently in the adjacent formal living room, hidden completely from view, but able to hear every single word. An Investigator Miller was parked right in the driveway, waiting for my signal. "Read it over," my father commanded, sliding the NDA across the table. It was a masterpiece of legal jargon, disguising a bribe as a family dispute settlement. It explicitly detailed the wire transfer of funds in exchange for my permanent silence and departure. It was the final nail in their coffin. And the wire transfer? I asked, keeping my voice steady. My father turned his laptop around, showing a banking screen with a pending transfer of $500,000 to the dummy account Miller had set up. It executes the moment you sign, he said coldly. I picked up the gold pen. I let it hover over the signature line for 5 agonizing seconds. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, I set the pen down. I looked at my father, dropping the facade completely. My posture straightened, and the fake desperation vanished from my eyes, replaced by pure, freezing contempt. You know, Dad, I said, my voice echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged room. You really should have checked the date on that life insurance application before you forged my name. September 14th. I was already halfway across the world, completely off the grid. The color instantly drained from his face. His confident sneer collapsed into a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. My mother let out a sharp gasp, dropping her wine glass onto the floor for the second time that week. Before they could even speak, I pressed the hidden button on my jacket to signal Miller. What are you talking about? My father stammered, his eyes darting toward the front door. I'm talking about federal insurance fraud, Dad, I said, my voice rising with righteous fury. I'm talking about the deleted emails from the volunteer agency, proving you knew I was safe. I'm talking about this NDA you just drafted, proving you are actively trying to bribe a witness to conceal a $2 million felony. The front door suddenly clicked open. Investigator Miller walked into the foyer, holding a badge and a thick file, followed by 2 uniformed local police officers. At the same time, Chloe stepped out from the living room shadows, tears streaming down her face, staring at our parents with absolute disgust. The trap had slammed shut. The big reveal completely shattered my parents' arrogant reality. Instantly, the facade of a united front dissolved into a pathetic, desperate scramble for survival. My mother shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my father. It was his idea, she screamed hysterically, backing away from the table. I didn't want to do it. He forged the papers. He forced me to go along with it to save the business. My father roared in anger, lunging toward her before an officer stepped in. You greedy witch, you picked out the new cars before the ink was even dry on the death certificate, he yelled, his face purple with rage. The masks had completely slipped, revealing the pathetic, selfish monsters beneath. They turned on each other like starved animals, spilling years of resentments and financial crimes right in front of the police. Miller just stood there, calmly recording the entire meltdown on his phone. I watched the 2 people who had raised me be aggressively handcuffed and read their Miranda rights right in the middle of their stolen, lavish dining room. I felt no pity, no sadness, and absolutely no remorse. I only felt a profound, overwhelming sense of justice. I watched the police cruisers pull away, knowing my long journey back to life was beginning. The fallout was swift, brutal, and entirely public. My parents were denied bail, deemed flight risks due to the massive amounts of stolen liquid assets they possessed. The federal prosecutors didn't even need to work hard. Investigator Miller handed them a silver platter of forged documents, wire fraud attempts, and a recorded bribery confession. Within days, the government froze all of their accounts. The newly renovated mansion, the luxury cars, and the failing contracting business were all seized as proceeds of a crime. It was a spectacular, absolute downfall. But sending my parents to prison didn't magically fix my life. I was still, legally speaking, a dead man. The complex, painful process of legally reversing a death certificate took 8 exhausting months of court hearings, DNA tests, and endless bureaucratic red tape. I had to stand before a judge and prove that I was breathing. It was a surreal, humiliating experience to have to legally justify my own existence because my parents had traded my life for a payout. During that time, Chloe and I lived together in her small apartment, leaning heavily on each other for support. She had to navigate the brutal reality of watching our parents face up to 20 years in federal prison, while I had to navigate the trauma of knowing my own mother and father considered my life completely disposable. We spent hours in therapy, unpacking the decades of narcissistic abuse and manipulation that we had previously normalized. It strained my mental health severely. There were days I couldn't get out of bed, haunted by the memory of my mother's terrified face when I first walked through the door. I had to learn how to exist in a world where the foundational trust of a family was permanently, irreparably shattered. But piece by piece, document by document, I clawed my way back into the legal system, reclaiming my name, my social security number, and my absolute right to simply exist. Eventually, the judge struck down the death certificate, and I was finally, officially reborn. It has been 2 years since my parents were convicted of federal insurance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. They are currently serving lengthy sentences in separate minimum security facilities. I have not visited them, and I returned their letters completely unopened. I learned the hard way that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and DNA does not automatically earn your love or your forgiveness. Rebuilding my relationship with Chloe has been the single brightest light in this entire nightmare. We lost our parents, but we found a true, unbreakable bond with each other. We are the only two people on Earth who truly understand the depth of what we survived. Today, I am legally alive. I have a new job, a small apartment of my own, and I have slowly started traveling again, refusing to let their greed steal my adventurous spirit. The biggest lesson I learned from being legally dead is the true value of a quiet, honest life. My parents chased wealth and public image so aggressively that they sacrificed their own humanity to get it. They traded their son for marble countertops, and now they live in concrete cells. For anyone out there dealing with toxic, manipulative family members, hear this. You do not owe them your peace, your sanity, or your life. If someone shows you that they value your utility more than your heartbeat, believe them the first time and walk away. You are allowed to build your own chosen family, grounded in actual love rather than transaction. I survived a devastating flood in the remote mountains of Indonesia, but my greatest survival story was escaping the crushing, greedy gravity of my own parents. I am Marcus. I am 27 years old, and despite everything they tried to do to me, I am still standing. I finally have my identity back, and no one will ever take it from me again.